Welcome back to the channel. Today we're breaking down one of the most confusing, high-stakes developments in global politics right now, the Iran ceasefire, and asking a question that almost nobody is answering honestly. Is this actually a win for the United States, or is it the kind of deal that looks like peace on the surface, but quietly shifts power away from Washington? At first glance, the ceasefire sounds like a relief. After weeks of escalating strikes, threats of wider war, and global panic over oil supplies, the United States and Iran have agreed to pause hostilities, at least temporarily. The fighting stopped just hours before a major escalation deadline, and that alone tells you how close things were to spiraling completely out of control. But here's where things get complicated. This is not a traditional peace deal. It's a 2-week ceasefire, not a resolution, not a settlement, a pause. And that distinction matters more than most people realize, because what looks like de-escalation can sometimes be strategic repositioning. The reality is the ceasefire didn't solve the core issues that caused the conflict in the first place. Iran's nuclear program, still unresolved. Its missile capabilities, not even part of the discussion in any meaningful way. Its regional influence through proxy groups, still intact. So what exactly did the United States gain here? On paper, the U.S. avoided a wider war. That's the headline victory. A prolonged conflict with Iran would have been massively expensive, politically risky, and economically disruptive, not just for America, but for the entire global system. Even the IMF has warned that just a few weeks of conflict have already caused long-term economic damage that won't fully recover, even if peace holds. That's the first key point. The U.S. avoided escalation, but avoiding disaster is not the same as winning. Because if you look deeper, Iran walked into this ceasefire with a very specific strategy, and it's one that could actually reshape the balance of power in the region. One of the biggest concerns revolves around the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway is one of the most critical choke points in global trade, especially for oil. And under Iran's proposed terms, Tehran retains influence, if not outright control, over how traffic moves through it. Think about what that means. If Iran can influence or restrict access to that route, it gains leverage not just over the United States, but over Europe, Asia, and every economy dependent on energy flows. That's not just a regional advantage, that's global power. And suddenly the ceasefire starts to look less like a diplomatic victory and more like a strategic concession. Even more concerning for Washington is the broader list of demands tied to the negotiations. Iran has pushed for sanctions relief, release of frozen assets, and even a reduction of U.S. military presence in the region. Now, not all of these demands have been accepted, but the fact that they're on the table and that negotiations are happening under pressure changes the dynamics. Because negotiations during a ceasefire are not neutral. They are shaped by leverage. And right now, Iran has more leverage than people expected. Why? Because despite heavy strikes and economic pressure, Iran's core military and political structure remains intact. Intelligence assessments suggest that even significant infrastructure damage is unlikely to destabilize the regime in the short term. So instead of collapsing, Iran absorbed the order and kept standing. That changes everything. It means the U.S. didn't force a decisive outcome. It forced a pause. And in geopolitics, a pause can benefit the side that needs time. There's also a deeper, more uncomfortable layer to this. The ceasefire exposes a fundamental limitation in U.S. strategy, the inability to fully control escalation in a multi-actor conflict. Because even as Washington and Tehran agreed to stop direct hostilities, other actors, like Israel and regional militias, continued operations that threatened to break the ceasefire almost immediately. That's a huge problem, because it means the United States doesn't fully control the battlefield, even when it's directly involved. And if you can't control your own allies or the wider conflict environment, then your negotiating position weakens, no matter how strong your military is. Now let's talk about perception. In geopolitics, perception is power. And globally, this ceasefire is being interpreted in very different ways. Some see it as a necessary step back from the brink. Others see it as a rushed deal that leaves dangerous issues unresolved. But in parts of the Middle East, there's a growing concern that stopping the conflict without dismantling Iran's capabilities simply gives Tehran time to regroup and come back stronger. That perception matters, because if regional allies start believing that the U.S. is unwilling or unable to finish what it starts, it changes how they align themselves in the future. And that's where the real risk emerges, not in the ceasefire itself, but in what it signals, a signal that the U.S. may prefer de-escalation over decisive outcomes, a signal that prolonged conflict is politically unsustainable, a signal that strategic patience might outlast American pressure. Now, here's the twist most people aren't talking about. Even if the ceasefire holds, the economic damage is already done. Oil markets have been shaken, supply chains disrupted, investor confidence weakened, and all of this feeds into a larger narrative: instability in the global system. And instability is expensive. For the United States, that means higher inflation risks, energy price volatility, and increased pressure on economic policy. But for countries outside the Western system, especially those already pushing for alternatives to the dollar, it creates opportunity. Because every major disruption tied to US-led conflict raises a question in global markets. Is dependence on this system too risky? And once that question starts being asked consistently, the long-term consequences can be massive. So, is the ceasefire a strategic win for the United States? In the short term, maybe. It avoided a catastrophic escalation. It prevented immediate economic shock from spiraling further. It bought time. But in the long term, it may have exposed weaknesses. It may have strengthened Iran's negotiating position. It may have signaled limits to American power projection. And it may have accelerated shifts in how the world views U.S. dominance. That's the real story. Because this isn't just about Iran. It's about what happens when a superpower chooses to pause instead of finish, and whether that pause creates stability or simply delays a much bigger confrontation waiting just ahead. Because history shows us something uncomfortable. Ceasefires and conflicts like this rarely end the story. They reshape it, they shift timelines, redistribute pressure, and allow both sides to prepare for what comes next. And in many cases, the side that benefits most from a ceasefire is not the one that looked strongest during the fighting, but the one that uses the pause more effectively. Right now, Iran has something it didn't have before this conflict began: proof that it can withstand direct pressure from the United States without collapsing. That alone is a strategic message, not just to Washington, but to every country watching closely. And countries are watching. From China to Russia, from Gulf states to emerging economies, everyone is analyzing what just happened. Not just the military side, but the political signals underneath it. Because what unfolded here wasn't just a clash between two nations, it was a stress test of American influence. And the results were mixed. On one hand, the U.S. demonstrated its ability to strike, to mobilize, and to force negotiations under pressure. That still matters. Military dominance is still real. But on the other hand, the U.S. did not achieve a decisive transformation of Iran's behavior. It didn't dismantle its nuclear infrastructure. It didn't eliminate its regional networks. It didn't secure long-term guarantees. Instead, it paused. And in global politics, pauses can be interpreted as hesitation. That perception opens the door for something even bigger: strategic recalibration by other powers. Take China, for example. Beijing has been quietly expanding its economic and diplomatic presence across the Middle East for years. It has positioned itself as a stabilizer, a trade partner, and an alternative to U.S.-led alliances. A prolonged U.S.-Iran conflict would have disrupted that strategy. But a ceasefire? That gives China space. Space to negotiate, space to invest, space to deepen ties with countries that may now be questioning how reliable U.S. security guarantees really are. And then there's Russia, which benefits from instability in energy markets and any shift that weakens Western cohesion. The longer the perception lingers that U.S. interventions create volatility without resolution, the more Moscow gains leverage in both energy and geopolitics. So the ceasefire doesn't just affect Iran and the United States, it ripples outward, reshaping the calculations of multiple global players. Now let's go deeper into the economic dimension, because this is where the long-term consequences could become even more serious. Every major conflict tied to the United States carries a financial footprint. Military spending increases. Energy prices fluctuate. Trade routes become uncertain. And investors, who hate uncertainty more than anything, start looking for safer alternatives. That's where the real risk begins. Because global finance is built on confidence. Confidence in the dollar, confidence in U.S. stability, confidence in predictable outcomes. But when conflicts repeatedly disrupt global markets without clear resolutions, that confidence starts to erode, not suddenly, but gradually. And gradual shifts are the most dangerous because they're easy to ignore until they reach a tipping point. We're already seeing early signs of this. Some countries are exploring alternative payment systems. Others are increasing gold reserves. There's more discussion around trading energy in non-dollar currencies. These are not immediate threats to the dollar's dominance, but they are indicators of long-term change. And every geopolitical event like this accelerates that conversation. So, while the ceasefire may have prevented a short-term economic shock, it may have contributed to a longer-term shift in how the global system operates. Now, here's where things get even more complex. The United States is not operating in a vacuum. Domestic politics play a massive role in decisions like this. War fatigue is real. After decades of prolonged conflicts, there is little appetite, both politically and publicly, for another long-term engagement in the Middle East. That reality shapes strategy, whether leaders admit it or not, and Iran knows that. Iran's strategy has always been built around endurance. It doesn't need to win quickly, it just needs to outlast pressure, to absorb blows, to stretch timelines, to make the cost of continued confrontation higher than the cost of compromise. In that sense, a ceasefire aligns perfectly with Iran's long-term approach. It slows things down, it reduces immediate pressure. It opens the door for negotiations where Iran is still standing, still negotiating, still relevant, and that's a win in itself. Now consider the psychological aspect of this. When a conflict ends without a clear winner, both sides claim success. The United States frames it as preventing escalation. Iran frames it as resisting pressure. But perception doesn't stay neutral for long. Over time, narratives solidify. If Iran continues its activities largely unchanged after the ceasefire, the narrative will shift toward the U.S. applied pressure, and nothing fundamentally changed. And that perception can be more powerful than any single event, because it shapes expectations for future conflicts. It shapes how adversaries behave. It shapes how allies respond. And perhaps most importantly, it shapes how deterrence works, or doesn't. Deterrence is not just about military capability, it's about belief. The belief that if a line is crossed, there will be consequences that cannot be avoided. But if conflicts repeatedly end in pauses rather than decisive outcomes, that belief weakens. And when deterrence weakens, the likelihood of future challenges increases. That's the paradox of this ceasefire. It reduces immediate danger, but may increase long-term uncertainty. Now let's look ahead. What happens next depends on what both sides do during this pause. If the United States uses this time to build stronger alliances, clarify its strategy, and establish clear red lines, the ceasefire could become a foundation for stability. But if the pause leads to ambiguity, unclear goals, inconsistent messaging, and reactive decisions, then the next phase of the conflict could be even more unpredictable. For Iran, the strategy is clearer. Consolidate gains, maintain regional influence, continue advancing capabilities carefully without triggering immediate escalation, and wait, because time, in this scenario, is a resource. The longer the conflict remains unresolved, the more opportunities emerge for shifts in global power dynamics. And that brings us back to the original question, is the ceasefire a strategic win or a hidden risk? The honest answer is, it's both. It's a short-term win in the sense that it prevented a larger war. It's a hidden risk in the sense that it may have set the stage for deeper challenges down the line, challenges that are not immediately visible, challenges that unfold slowly, challenges that reshape the global balance of power in ways that are difficult to reverse. And that's what makes this moment so important, because the real impact of the ceasefire won't be determined by what happened this week. It will be determined by what happens next, by how the United States adapts, by how Iran responds, by how the rest of the world recalibrates, and by whether this pause becomes a turning point or just the quiet before something much bigger. So the next time you hear the word ceasefire, don't just think of peace. Think of positioning. Think of leverage. Think of what each side is gaining in the silence. Because in geopolitics, the loudest moves are often made when everything seems quiet. And that silence is where the real game begins. Behind closed doors, negotiations don't stop. They intensify. Intelligence agencies become more active, not less. Military planners don't stand down. They reassess, adapt, and prepare for scenarios that may never be publicly discussed. The headlines fade, but the stakes don't. In fact, they often rise because now the conflict has moved from visible confrontation to strategic maneuvering. This is where misunderstandings become dangerous. A ceasefire can create the illusion that tensions have eased, that both sides are stepping back. But in reality, both sides are watching each other more closely than ever. Every movement, every statement, every minor escalation becomes a signal. And when signals are misread, that's when conflicts reignite, sometimes faster and more violently than before. There's also the risk of overconfidence. If Washington believes the ceasefire represents control over the situation, it may underestimate how quickly things can shift again. If Tehran believes it has successfully resisted pressure, it may push boundaries further, testing how far it can go without triggering a response. And when both sides start testing limits at the same time, the margin for error disappears. That's how fragile moments turn into flashpoints. At the same time, smaller actors in the region, groups, militias, and allied forces, are not necessarily bound by the same discipline as major governments. They operate with their own motivations, their own timelines, and their own agendas. And it only takes one unexpected move from one of these actors to collapse the entire structure of a ceasefire. One strike, one retaliation, one miscalculation. And suddenly, everything resets. That's why this moment isn't stable, it's suspended. Suspended between escalation and restraint, between diplomacy and confrontation, between a future that leans toward negotiation and one that snaps back into conflict. And for the United States, the challenge now is not just managing Iran, it's managing the uncertainty that comes with this kind of pause, because uncertainty is where influence can slip, where alliances can drift, and where strategic clarity can fade. So while the world may see calm on the surface, what's happening underneath is anything but calm. It's calculation, it's positioning, it's preparation. And the outcome of all of it will depend on decisions that are being made right now, quietly, carefully, and far away from the headlines most people are watching. Because the truth is, this story didn't end with the ceasefire. It just became harder to see.